Welcome back to Before, During, and Beyond the Breach, sponsored by Verizon Enterprise Solutions on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Fornicola, and my guests today are Mike Denning, Vice President of Verizon's Global Security, and Brian Sartin, Managing Director of Verizon's Risk Team. Mike, let's talk about some ways that agencies and organizations can prepare themselves for what is likely to come in the future.
I think a very much a proactive approach. One of the things that we're seeing consistently, some of the most better prepared organizations that we talk to, is they're really starting to balance their spend between preparation and response. And I think this is an important point for the listeners to understand, is that a lot of preparation is kind of driven by compliance. I have to be compliant with various regulations. What we're seeing is much more some of the leading edge organizations looking at the detection side of that. So really focusing the efforts on what we call active hunting, or actively searching for breaches. The other thing I'll say is they're really looking and keeping that team protected from the daily administrative tasks of IT support. So whether they're doing it in-house or they're using a third-party provider, making sure that they have some level of diligence 24/7 around the clock, and actively look at incidents as they're detected from their various sensors that they have on the network.
And Brian, this is no longer just a CIO or a CISO problem. This is at the CEO level. This is at the agency head level.
Oh, yeah, there's no question. I think there's two camps of entities out there, at least those that kind of get the message and are taking steps towards breach prevention and doing it in the right way. I think camp number one are the folks that are taking it sort of from a bottom-up approach, if you will. And those are folks that view breach preparation as an IT technical and IT security type of equation. Certainly that's not bad, but clearly I think the demonstrated smarter way to do it is to look top down, that it is in fact a CEO and a board level issue, and it is about managing the brand's reputation, legal and reputational risk in the event of an emergency. So defining from the top down what matters and using that to define IT and technical response when these attacks happen. I mean, that's top down approach is what matters.
What kinds of solutions would you recommend?
I don't know that I'd recommend solutions in as much as certain areas where different types of solutions, hardware, software, even services would make sense. And clearly, to me, I mean, the one place that organizations, or at least enterprises and agencies, I'd say, want to focus on the most is around incident detection. And that inability to recognize and react to cyber attacks early on in the kill chain, before it leads to unauthorized access and data theft and, your name in the headlines. I mean, that's security's greatest weakness. But there's some other areas as well, I think, around two-factor authentication, patch management, and things like that make sense.
Yeah, what I'm seeing from a buying pattern behavior is organizations are very seriously looking at how do I get on the network detection, and there's a big push inside the organization to create these trusted internet connections between agencies at critical junctures on the network, because the one key thing that all breaches have in common is at some point that data has to be exfiltrated. That has to be removed from the network. And whether you catch them coming in or you catch them going out, you have to be actively monitoring the network. And there are various tools to do better jobs of managing the identities, helping with authentication. One key element that remains to be invested in, I see, is this kind of inline detection of the network.
Is there a difference between how to attack this from a commercial standpoint and a federal standpoint?
I don't think there's a significant difference. I think the best practice is the best practice. I think the sensitivity of some of the data in the federal space, what it does is really expands the threat landscape. So there is a greater need to understand and map your threats as a federal agency. Whereas oftentimes in the commercial sector, they're primarily targeting financial, sometimes trade secrets, but from a federal agency, I think it just expands the number of people that are coming coming after you.
The principles in incident handling are really the same, irrespective of victim demographics or where in the world. But the nature of the threats themselves do, in fact, vary. And that's a big area of research focus for us, is trying to understand not just, at the sector level, but within the subsector and for the individual enterprise, what types of cyber threats, based upon precedent, real-world incidents, not fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and the hype that you tend to hear about oftentimes around cyber attacks, what types of real-world incidents do impact enterprises or agencies of a certain type, location, where in the world, or what they do, and where does risk, IT and security risk, really exist based upon that. Trying to help folks understand where the smart money lies in terms of countermeasures and security strategy, that's our direction in threat research.
And as I understand, that's a real goal of the report, right, is to really get down deep into things. It's not just looking at numbers. It's really looking at some real-world situations and things that impact real people and organizations, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that is why you put data scientists on it, right? In addition to having a security background, but looking at that information, it reveals itself as you go deeper and deeper.
What have victims that you found that maybe got it wrong in their preparation, what are some of those signs or signals that you've seen after the fact?
The manipulation of the crime scene, manipulation or actuation, trying to influence findings, as well as covering up the situation. I mean, these are sort of the earmarks of folks that don't handle these very well. I mean, these are all facets, of course, that don't add up to success for the victim either.
A lot of what you guys do at the end of the day, while there's a lot of prep that goes into trying to fight off these types of situations, is reactive, right? Like you're reacting to what's happened. How do you go about trying to keep all that organized and then find the right path forward once you know that something's gone wrong?
I'll talk about it at a high level from a detection. I'll let Brian talk at the more specific. We are investing a lot from an analytics perspective, and in particular, we've been able to leverage a lot of fraud engines that we've built over numerous years of fighting, telecommunications fraud, cell phone fraud. We built some pretty robust engines for ingesting large amounts of data in order to fight fraud. Fraud patterns, they create patterns. And from the data breach report, we've been able to map 9 key patterns. So when you think about all the breaches we're looking at, we looked at over 80,000 incidents and over 2,000 breaches. So it's a large sample set. And that's just the data breach component. So we're looking at high speed, high volumes of data. I talk about finding a needle in a haystack of needles. It's really leveraging the investment we've made in fraud and analytics to find the bad actions and the bad actors. A lot of folks will say, hey, the people in my agency are good. Sometimes they're cleared. They're patriotic. They want to do the right thing. But it's a lot of times it's not. They're unwilling accomplices a lot of times of these breaches, and you still have to monitor behavioral and patterns that are out of the norm.
Just to add some color to that, every victim of a cyber attack, they firmly believe, and this is all the way up to the top of that victim's management chain, they firmly believe that they're dealing with a faceless adversary on the other end of the globe, and it's a technical, completely sophisticated situation that's never happened before and it'll never happen again. In reality, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it seems to us like we see the same, probably 25, 30 situations over and over again that just play out like a bad story on somebody else's network, somewhere in the globe. So for us in particular, that ability to use our backbone. I mean, you think about it, Verizon's got a big piece of the world's public internet traffic on a given day, and even when the sources and victims of cyber attacks are not directly connected to Verizon, those aspects of those attacks tend to traverse our network between point A and point B. That places us in the position of having certain visibility into attacks in motion as they traverse the internet, but importantly, it enables us to leverage some of these analytics that Mike just talked about to see the broader span of victims of an attack. As I said, it's not just one in a vacuum. It's many tens or hundreds of victims strung together by the same cyber attack. So that is important and pretty powerful precedent when we are engaged in a cyber investigation, a reactive situation, as you put it. That ability to use that precedent to understand the scale, the nature of the attack, the intel indicators, and all the moving parts necessary to contain it, determine the extent of informational losses, set the stage for prosecution or what have you. I mean, these are all things that precedent makes a big difference in. Yeah.
We're going to pause here for a short break. My guests today are Mike Denning, Vice President of Verizon's Global Security, and Brian Sartin, Managing Director of Verizon's Risk Team, on Before, During, and Beyond the Breach, sponsored by Verizon Enterprise Solutions. I'm your host, Jason Fornicola, and you're listening to FederalNewsRadio.com and 1500 AM.